Andrea Feldman was not the first of Andy Warhol's superstars to meet a tragic end, and she wouldn't be the last. Andrea "Whips" Feldman was born on April 1st, 1948. Born and raised into a wealthy New York family, she attended Quintano School for Young Professionals, which was a high school for the performing arts. Andrea met Andy Warhol in 1967 at Max's Kansas City. She was there with friends Geraldine Smith and Patty d'Arbanville. Both Geraldine and Patty would appear in Andy Warhol's film Flesh. Photographer-presenter Anton Pirich has released an interview with some additional footage from 1970 of Andrea Feldman online. She talks about how she first met Andy Warhol, saying, quote, "Happened just like this. I walked into Max's Kansas City and Andy Warhol fell in love with me and asked me to be in one of his fabulous movies. So there I was, just like Brian Jones, and there he was looking absolutely fantastic. So I said, well, maybe, but I didn't really want to be in one of his films. But then I decided, well, why not? Took me a year to be in one of his films. So there I am again, 3 of his films, and I'm really getting up there." Feldman would strike a working relationship with Andy Warhol and would become one of his superstars with roles in Imitation of Christ, Trash, and Heat. Warhol filmed his movie Imitation of Christ in January of 1967. This was the first Warhol film in which Andrea Feldman would appear. She starred alongside Taylor Mead, Nico, and Bridget Berlin. Feldman played the role of the son's girlfriend. The film would later be reworked and re-released by Andy Warhol and Paul Morrissey 2 years later in 1969. The second Warhol film that Feldman starred in was Trash. It was produced by Andy Warhol and directed by Paul Morrissey. WarholStars.org describes Trash thusly, quote, "Trash is basically the story of a junkie, Joe, who can't get it up despite numerous attempts by his co-stars, including Jerry Miller, the stripper, Holly, who he lives with, Andrea Feldman, an acid freak, and Jane Forth, a wealthy woman whose apartment he breaks into." Bob Colicello, who was writing for The Village Voice, wrote, quote, "At one point he, Joe, is picked up by a phony rich acid freak, Andrea Feldman, who, licking her own breasts, screams, 'I'd like to be a cock, one big cock.' A gross, grotesque, but nonetheless genuine plea for release from the repressive rigidity of sexual roles, from the corrosive power struggles of human relationships. In a highly unreal yet utter realistic manner, Trash thus becomes a social document." Trash was filmed over several weekends in October of 1969. It co-starred Joe D'Alessandro, Holly Woodlawn, Jane Forth, and Michael Sklar. Trash was the second film that Andrea Feldman had worked on with director Paul Morrissey. Andrea played the role of the rich girl. Liz Derringer, a music journalist and regular at Andy Warhol's factory from 1968 to 1987, mentioned Andrea Feldman in a quote to the New York Times in 2018. Quote, "It really wasn't a party until you ran into Andy. Andrea Feldman brought me up to the original factory one night and she said, 'We're going with Andy to the opening of a new nightclub.' It was called Salvation. It was on Sheridan Square. They picked us up in a limo and I was so impressed to be sitting with Andy Warhol." Andrea Feldman, as a regular in the back room at Max's Kansas City, she appeared in a documentary called Groupies in 1970. It was in this documentary that she referred to herself by a nickname that was given to her by the Warhol crowd, Andrea "Whips" Feldman. She also referred to herself as Andrea Warhol, or was known by her friends as Crazy, as reported by Wikipedia. Here is what Warhol star Penny Arcade had to say about Andrea Feldman. Quote, "A lot of people in the Warhol scene pretended to be crazy, but Andrea really was. She had endless money for everything but mental health, When she had nervous breakdowns, her parents would send her to state hospitals before she came out, and she knew she was about to be a star. She had a nervous breakdown, and her physician told her parents that what she needed was a job. I remember her saying, "What am I supposed to do, be a waitress?" Heat was the last Andy Warhol film that Andrea Feldman would appear in. It co-starred Joe D'Alessandro, Sylvia Miles, and Pat Ast. Feldman played the role of Jessica, Sally's daughter. During the filming of Heat, Andy Warhol would make late-night calls to the three lead actresses. WarholStars.org quoted Bob Colacella, the quote, "Three actresses were meant to hate each other. They were all in a typical Paul Morrissey schema. After Joe and after Andy's calls they did, he made Sylvia jealous of Pat Halston's moo-moos, he made Pat jealous of Sylvia's star billing, and it didn't take much to drive poor Andrea crazy." Heat would prove to be a commercial success, making $2 million in the United States and receiving praise from the mainstream critics. But not all reviews were as good. Peter Sheldall said, quote, "Miss Feldman with her twisted little face and frightening laugh was clearly in a bad way, and the pit-list exposure of her mood makes Heat a repellent document." New York Magazine critic Judith Crist wrote, quote, "The most striking performance, in large part non-performance, comes from the late Andrea Feldman as a flat-voiced, freaked-out daughter, a mass of psychotic confusion, infantile and heartbreaking." Andrea's last interview was on July 29, 1972, by Greg Ford for Interview magazine. She said of being a Warhol star, quote, "They just throw you up in front of a camera, they don't care what you look like, and they just use and abuse you, and step on you, and they don't pay you anything. I'm very depressed about the whole thing because I know I'm a damn good actress, and I've been brought down by Warhol, and I've been mistreated by them, and Paul Morrissey told me I was the best actress he ever had." Before Andy Warhol's movie Heat was released on August 8, 1972, Andrea Feldman, just days after returning from a European trip, unalived herself. It was the anniversary of the passing of Marilyn Monroe. Bob Colacello believed that Feldman thought that it was Andy Warhol's birthday. After summoning several boyfriends to the apartment building that she lived in with her parents at 5th Avenue and 12th Street on the 14th floor, she had a can of Coke in one hand and a rosary in the other, according to Bob Colacello. When she jumped, all of the men she had invited were waiting for her on the street below. One of those men was poet Jim Carroll. Lee Black Childers says, quote, "Andrea and I were engaged at the time, and we were going to get married. It was sort of a ploy at first, but it started to get serious. Her parents would commit her to Bellevue now and then to keep her under their thumb. Things seemed to get a little strange between us when I got back from doing Pork, a play we were performing in England. It was real wild for a while there, and Andrea was acting very strange toward me, like she didn't trust me all of a sudden. In the middle of all the mayhem, Andrea stood up on a chair and held a picture of Marilyn Monroe over her head and just stood there, and a couple of people at other tables said, 'Oh, it's showtime.' After a long time just standing there, she said, 'Marilyn, love me while you can.' The next day, she jumped from the 14th floor window of her uncle's apartment. She left a note that said, quote, 'I'm headed for the big time. I'm on my way up there with James Dean and Marilyn Monroe.' Andrea Feldman's friend, Geraldine Smith, who starred in Andy Warhol's Flesh, wrote Andrea's obit for the Village Voice, saying, quote, "Andrea Feldman of Andy Warhol's Superstars jumped to her death on August 8th at 4:30 p.m. from a 14th floor window at 51 Fifth Ave, taking with her a crucifix and a Bible she found in a church a few days before. Andrea left a note addressed to everyone she knew saying that she loved us all, but, quote, 'I'm going for the big time. I hit the jackpot.' But very quickly after, rumors began to swirl about the actual note left behind by Andrea Feldman. It was not as kind as her friend had made it out to be. Bob Colacello said, quote, In the back room of Max's, the old superstars were saying that Geraldine had been kind in print. The note wasn't to everyone, and it wasn't about love. It was to Andy, and it was very, very nasty. Andy Warhol did not attend Andrea Feldman's funeral. Because of Andrea's unaliving, Andy Warhol and Paul Morrissey made the decision that the October premiere of Heat would be a subdued event. In 1976, there was a documented discussion between biographer Jeffrey Morgan and Lou Reed. Lou Reed says, quote, "It's like when Andrea Feldman committed suicide. She jumped out the window and she said she was trying for the big time and the only thing anybody in New York ever had to mention about her was that she landed so hard on the sidewalk that she left footprints." Was gonna say prints, I don't know why, but it must have been because it was a tragedy for a cow or a horse. Andrea Feldman, that's not romantic. She changed it to Andrea Warhol. Morgan said, "Wasn't it whips?" To which Reed replies, quote, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, Andrea whips Feldman." She was 24 years of age. Well, that's it for today, guys. I want to thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any comments in the section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And I will see you guys again for my next upload.